Welcome to College Football March Madness. I've gathered 68 of the top teams in the country, and today they'll be competing in a single elimination tournament until we're left with one winner. Just like the regular tournament, the top teams are given automatic spots in the bracket, but for those teams that didn't quite make the cut, then they're about to learn their fate via our one and only selection show. We're then gonna simulate every single game in College Football 25 to see who gets upset, who's gonna be our Cinderella stories, and who's gonna take home the coveted national championship for our first ever College Football March Madness. But before we get into that, we first have to see what our bracket's gonna look like, and starting with our top four #1 seeds, we have Miami leading the pack, followed by Alabama, Ohio State, and lastly, none other than Texas A&M. Each of these teams will be placed in their own region on our map, and each of these regions will determine where the teams actually play. Starting with our Peach region, the Miami Hurricanes will be taking on the winner of our first play-in game, which is gonna be between Michigan State and Indiana. Moving on down to the 8th and 9th seeds, we have the Maryland Terrapins taking on the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. And as for the 5th seed, that spot's being filled by Virginia Tech, who will have to try and avoid the upset against Marshall, who comes into the tournament as a 12th seed. Then moving on down to the 4th seed, NC State, they'll have to take on one of the top teams from the Mid-American Conference, Central Michigan. That wraps up our top half of the Peach region, but we're keeping it going with the bottom half, starting with Missouri as our 6th seed, taking on Old Dominion, who's 11th. Moving down to our 3rd seed, we have our actual first IRL playoff team in the tournament with Notre Dame, and they'll have to take on UAB, who's coming into this thing as a number 14 seed. And on down to the 7th seed, we've once again got another IRL playoff team in Penn State, and they'll have to take down number 10 seeded Pittsburgh if they want to stay alive in our tournament. But finally, wrapping up our Peach region, we have our number 2 seed Liberty up against our second Mid-American team, Toledo. And that officially fills up our first quarter of the bracket, and honestly, if I had to predict any upsets, I could totally see a world where Michigan plays Virginia Tech close, as well as Old Dominion shocking the SEC. But before we get to see those games, we first have to fill out the rest of our brackets. Let's move down to the Rose region, where teams will be playing every one of their games in the Rose Bowl. Get it? Rose region to the Rose Bowl. Anyways, our number 1 seed down in this portion of the bracket is none other than Texas A&M. They'll be taking on the newly acquired Bill Belichick and the rest of North Carolina, so honestly, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if this was a lot closer than many people would think. But moving on down to the 8 and 9 seeded game, we're gonna see Tennessee have to travel all the way across the country to face the host team UCLA. And this same thing applies to our 5th seed Michigan, who will have to travel 1,938 miles to face 12th seeded Arizona. And wrapping up the top half of our Rose region, we're gonna see BYU take on 13 seed Cal Berkeley. And I honestly don't know what it is about Cal Berkeley, but I feel like they always play well in these type of competitions, so honestly, give me them over the 4 seeds. But moving on down to our 6th seed, that spot's getting filled by the Mountain West powerhouse Boise State. And they'll have to play the winner of our second play-in game between Texas Tech and Nebraska. I don't even know who would win that matchup in real life, but filling up our 3rd seed, we've got mini Zach Wilson in Utah up against number 14 seed Wyoming. The winner of that game will have to take on the winner from our previous matchup, but moving on to our last 2 games, we have 7th seed Miami, Ohio taking on the 10th seed Oklahoma State, as well as 2 seed Oregon up against the 15th seed San Diego State. Honestly, out of this region, I can totally see Boise State and Oregon going on the run, and as for upsets, I'm placing Texas A&M and of course BYU under watch. But with half of the bracket filled out, this is what one side of it looks like, and this is also a great time to mention that I've also placed a link down in the description with a blank bracket so that you guys can follow along with the tournament and try to make a few predictions as well. But now it's time to move over to the Goodyear region, where teams will have to play in the Cotton Bowl, and kicking things off, we've got Ohio State as our 1 seed, taking on one of the worst teams in the tournament, Mississippi. Now, I don't know how this came to be, because personally, I got Mississippi State over a lot of these other smaller schools, but in order to get our rankings, I simulated a full season in Dynasty and made a list of the top 68 teams in terms of championship contenders. So if you guys got a problem or your team just doesn't end up making it, be sure to blame EA and the committee, because I had no right in choosing the teams. If I did, then Coastal Carolina would totally be getting a spot in the tournament, but as you guys will be able to see, that just didn't end up happening. But in our 8 and 9 game, we have Rice taking on Wisconsin, and below that, we have our 5th seed Louisville taking on 12th seed Tulsa. That game's winner will get to play the victor coming out of our next matchup between 4th seed Syracuse and 13th seed Fresno State, and I could definitely see a world where we get both the 12th and 13th seed playing against each other in the round of 32. But as for the bottom half of our Goodyear region, we're starting with the 6th seed TCU taking on the winner of our 3rd play-in game between 11 seeds Texas State and LSU. And just because how good the SEC is, I really think LSU has a good chance to come out of both of these games. They might not have the easiest path in the tournament, and after those games, they'd have to play the winner of number 3 seed Kansas State and 14th seed USC, but I think the Tigers could really put up a pretty decent fight. And this leaves us with two matchups left, and those are between North Texas taking on Oklahoma and Texas as our second seed taking on 15th seed Baylor. Honestly, I think this region either comes down to Ohio State, Kansas State, or Texas, but moving on to the bottom right quadrant of the bracket, this is the Pop-Tart region. And our final number one seed of the tournament, Alabama, will be starting out by facing the winner of our final play-in game between Ball State and FSU. Basically the battle of mid. But moving down to our next game, we have 8th seed Florida taking on number 9 seed Arkansas, so that means we finally get to see an SEC matchup in the round of 64. But moving right below that, we actually end up getting another SEC team as we have the 5th seed Georgia taking on 12th seed Buffalo. I feel like Georgia might end up getting the advantage for the majority of this tournament because they're the second highest overall, but only the 5th seed in the tournament. But if they were to make it out of the round of 64, they'd have to play the winner of 4th seed Ole Miss and 13th seed Kennesaw State. And that wraps it up for our first half of the Pop-Tart region, and if I had to call any upsets, I feel like I would have to go with Arkansas over Florida, but a 9 seed beating an 8 seed isn't really too uncommon, so let me know if you guys consider that one an upset. If I had to guess, the upper portion will most likely be decided by a Georgia-Alabama game, but moving down to the second half of the region, we have 6th-seeded Louisiana Raging Cajuns taking on the 11th seed Nevada. This is followed by 3rd seed Tulane up against Florida Atlantic, and in both of these matchups, I feel like I would personally take the higher seeded teams. But then again, this is March Madness, so really anything can happen, but moving further down in our bracket, we have 7th seed Kansas taking on 10th seed App State. And I know as the selection show host, I should stay pretty neutral, but I swear if App State somehow beats Kansas, we're all just riding. Like, end of the video for sure. But wrapping up the selection show, we officially have our last 2nd seed Clemson having to face number 15 seed Jacksonville State at the very bottom of our bracket. So there you have it, our finalized bracket for college football March Madness, but now it's time to eliminate 4 teams right off the bat in all of our play-in games. So kicking things off in our first ever game of the tournament, Indiana was able to take down Michigan State in dominant fashion with a score of 34-10. But it didn't take long for us to get our first dramatic finish of the tournament. Down 9-14, Texas Tech was able to pull off the comeback, scoring a touchdown against Nebraska late, but with 43 seconds left on the clock, the Cornhuskers were able to drive down the field into field goal range, setting up a game-tying kick just to kick the ball wide right. Definitely not a good look to start out the tourney for kickers, but both of our other playing games weren't too interesting, with Ball State beating Florida State 31-24 and LSU absolutely rolling Texas State 17-0. But now that those playing games are done, it's time to kick off tournament play, starting with the Peach region. Surprisingly, our number 1 seed Miami was forced into overtime by Indiana, but in the end, they end up coming out on top 23-20, and this game was followed by Wake Forest coming in clutch on defense with a game-sealing pick, resulting in a final score of their game being 17-13. This means that our first matchup in the round of 32 will be number 1 seed Miami up against number 9 seed Wake Forest, but before we find out who wins that one, we're gonna have to work through all the rest of our round of 64 games. Moving on, it appears that I was completely wrong about my Marshall upset because Virginia Tech blew them out of the water 31-13, and NC State would carry on this trend in their game against Central Michigan, winning 17-0. So NC State is officially the first team in the tournament to shut out their opponent, but we're going right back to our close games as Missouri just barely takes care of business against ODU. And I genuinely couldn't have written this any better because UAB was able to pull off the first big upset of the tournament, stopping the Fighting Irish 5 yards short on the very last play of the game. Say what you want about Notre Dame, but they will always be chokers in my book. Moving on to our next results, Penn State was able to manhandle Pitt 31-0 and wrap up Peach play in the round of 64. 2 seed Liberty was able to finally take care of business against Toledo after multiple OTs. And this brings us down to the Rose region where UNC almost had it against Texas A&M, but the Aggies survived and Bill Belichick's run in our first ever tournament has officially come to an end. It looks like the Aggies' next game will be up against the 8-seeded Vols as Tennessee takes down the host team UCLA 17-14. And this was also the score of the Michigan-Arizona game where the 2024 national champions prevailed. But even though this next game looked pretty close, Cal Berkeley had it from the start, and just like most of Travis Hunter's stats, BYU just scored in garbage time. And I don't know why this started happening, but in the Rose region, everyone started to love the score 17-14. Not only did both Tennessee and Michigan already win by that score, but we also saw Boise State beat Texas Tech by that margin, and Utah basically won in the same fashion, except they wanted to be quirky and miss an extra point in doing so. Luckily, that trend wouldn't continue though, as Miami, Ohio put up 31 points against the Cowboys, and this result was basically as disappointing as their whole 2025 season. But wrapping up the round of 64 play in this region, Oregon swept San Diego State 35-3, and both Tez Johnson and Dylan Gabriel wanted to tell the other teams that they meant business come this trip. But this is officially what our bracket is looking like on the left, and moving over to the top right with the Goodyear region, we kick things off with Ohio State barely beating Mississippi State 10-3. For those of you that don't watch college basketball, this game was way closer in terms of seeding than it should have been because the 16 seed has only beaten the 1 seed 2 times in the history of the basketball tournament. Luckily though, Ohio State fans don't have to be disappointed in their performance as they do live to see another day, but in the round of 32, they'll need to step it up as they're going up against Wisconsin, who took Rice to double OT just to win 27-24. But moving on to our other results, we saw Louisville blow out Tulsa 34-7, and in shocking fashion, 4th seed Syracuse fell to 13th seed Fresno State due to a Kyle McCord pick on the very first play of overtime. Moving on to LSU versus TCU, the game was back and forth up until the 4th quarter, but LSU was able to barely pull ahead, and they locked in their spot in the round of 32 with a score of 31-29. The Goodyear region is already delivering more upsets than the rest of our bracket combined, and things look to be continuing like that late in the 4th quarter of Kansas State versus USC's game, but Avery Johnson was able to hit sophomore tight end Garrett Oakley for the game-winning score. Another slow start happened in our next matchup. However, when this one came to the end, North Texas proved dominant, beating Oklahoma 35-7. And finally, wrapping up our region play, Texas started out hot against Baylor, but after getting shut out in the second half, I would say the Longhorns were pretty lucky to win this one 17-11. And that leaves us with just 8 more games left in the round of 64, and to continue those, we have to move down to the Pop-Tart region. If I had to guess, this is probably the region that most people are going to be rooting for just because of the mascot alone. And now might be a good time to mention that if you guys couldn't guess it, all these games will be taking place at the official Pop-Tart Bowl. And kicking things off, Alabama got right to work playing Ball State close in the first half, but pulling away for a score of 35-14 by the end of the second. This would be followed up by a really close match between Florida and Arkansas, but after a strong defensive hold, the Gators booked their ticket straight to the round of 32. Both of our next results would turn out in blowouts favoring the SEC schools, with Georgia beating Buffalo 31-10 and Ole Miss taking down the Owls 28-0. I honestly don't even know why the committee would ever think that these matchups would be fair, but remember, that's a secret group inside of EA and totally not my doing. But after being in a prime position to win their game, all Louisiana had to do was hold onto the ball and run out the clock, but they couldn't even do that as they turned the ball over back to Nevada, resulting in a fight for their life that they would eventually end up winning. This would then lead to the Raging Cajuns taking on Tulane in the round of 32 as they won their game 20-10. And I'm just so happy that Kansas wiped the floor with App State because I don't even know what I'd do as a Coastal fan seeing that upset happen, but luckily I don't have to worry about it. As for our final game in the round of 64, we had Clemson up against Jacksonville State, and this game went exactly how you would expect. Clemson came out on top 31-7, and this is our first look at our 32 teams remaining in college football March Madness. The round of 32 is up next though, and we're jumping back over to the Peach region to see what happens as Miami takes on Wake Forest. This match was actually pretty close for the first bit, but the future first round draft pick of the NFL pulled away from the Demon Deacons after halftime, giving us a final score of 42-17. And on top of that, Virginia Tech, who I had being upset in round 1, carried on their dominant performance, easily taking care of NC State, and so this officially gives us our first matchup in the Sweet 16. Let me know down in the comments if your team's still in the running, but moving on, we've got Missouri versus UAB. As spread out as these teams are, UAB put up a crazy fight, taking the Tigers to overtime, but in the end, Brady Cook took over and scrambled for a game-winning tutty. And this brings us to our last game of the region, and that's between Liberty and Penn State. And honestly, I feel like this has to be one of the craziest results in our tournament so far, as Liberty takes this one 21-14. I guess this isn't really an upset in terms of the tournament, but from a football perspective, this is crazy work by Jamie Chadwell. However, moving on down to the Rose region, we're kicking the round of 32 playoff with Texas A&M going up against 8th seed Tennessee Vols. And even though the Vols were able to take down the region hosts in the round of 64, they weren't able to take down TAMU as we got our first team going into the Rose's Sweet 16. But y'all need to remember that this is March Madness, and that means that anyone can win on any given day. And I feel like that definitely applies to our next matchup, as this is really gonna shock y'all. In a matchup between Cal Berkeley and Michigan, we somehow had Cal Berkeley taking down the 2024 national champions 17-10. That's got to be a huge accomplishment for that program, and it looks like we might actually have our first Cinderella story in the making. But moving on to the bottom half of the region, we saw Maddox Madsen take over in clutch time, moving the Broncos down the field and allowing Boise State to knock out Utah with a game-winning kick. Now moving on to our last game in the region, I need to give a huge congratulations to Miami, Ohio, as they officially got the first safety of the tournament. Sadly though, this didn't end up helping them out in the long run, as Oregon was easily able to take care of business, winning 35-16. So that means we've officially filled 8 of our 16 spots in the next round, and moving over to the Goodyear region, we sadly didn't get an upset as Ohio Ohio State easily blew by Wisconsin 34-3. This game was followed by Fresno State beating Tulsa's 31-10, and it looked like we'd have a game on our hands as LSU drove all the way down the field, putting a ton of pressure on Kansas State, all for Garrett Nussmeier to throw a game-sealing pick in the back of the end zone. This allowed Kansas State to secure their spot in the Sweet 16, but after a well-fought in-state matchup, Texas would end up locking in their spot as well over the Mean Green Fighting Machine. And this leaves us with just 4 more spots left, and one of those is being taken by one of the most powerful teams currently, Alabama. For the majority of their games, Bama's been playing their teams close, but right when the second half starts, they pull ahead massively. But I guess we'll just have to see how well they match up against Georgia, who just beat Ole Miss 20-14, and I had to let you Ole Miss fans know that this game wasn't even close at all. Y'all scored 2 garbage time touchdowns, so better luck next year, but you guys are gonna have to leave the tourney. And now moving on to our next game, I really don't know how to feel. On one hand, I guess it's good that the Sun Belt is getting even more coverage, but Louisiana is looking to be a force as they take down number 3 seed Tulane with a 48-yard game-winning field goal. We'll see if the Raging Cajuns can carry on their momentum against number 7 seed Kansas, because after a Cade Klubnik pick late, we're saying goodbye to our first 2 seed of the tournament. And that officially leaves us with these teams making up our Sweet 16, but now it's time to take these 16 teams down to our Elite 8. And going back up to the Peach region in the top left corner of our bracket, we get to see our number 1 team coming into the tournament, Miami, try to stay alive once again against our number 5 seed Virginia Tech. This once again resulted in a super close game, but in the end, Miami was able to take care of business with a field goal to spare as they would win 28-25. And it looks like we might not be having too many more blowouts because all these teams really deserve to be here at this point, and Liberty showed that in their matchup against Missouri as the Tigers just couldn't stop Caden Salter from running the football. I really hate that he's thrown away his career by transferring to Colorado, but I guess he's just trying to get his bag by going 2-10. But Colorado jokes aside, moving down to the Rose region, we're sadly saying goodbye to our underdogs over at Cal Berkeley because they ended up not being able to match up well against TAMU, losing 28-3. And yeah, I guess that's not great, but honestly, that's nothing to be too upset about. I feel like they had a really good run and honestly just not a good pull in terms of bracket placement, but if they did somehow manage to stay alive, they'd have to take on Oregon, who held off a comeback against Boise State. I think that score could have been much worse than their TAMU score, so maybe it was all just for the best. However, sadly, moving over to the Goodyear region, we also have to say goodbye to our other 13th seed Fresno State as Ohio State beat them 21-6. And honestly, I think that does mean that all of our Cinderella stories have come to an end, but let me know if your team's still in the running down in the comments below. Moving on to our matchup between Texas and Kansas State, this had to be the best game of the tournament so far. Kansas State was trailing Texas 13-17, but after scoring with 1 second left on the clock, somehow Kansas State was able to recover the onside kick, giving the school a ton of hope. Of course, the sim logic did want to show that it was still in control though, as they had Avery Johnson run straight out of bounds on the last play. I guess this one was pretty anticlimactic, but I think it also shows that Texas just wanted it more. They'll really have to put that to the test though, because their next matchup is against the reigning national champions. But before we get to see that game, we've got to fill up our last 2 spots in the Elite 8, and we're moving down to the Pop-Tart region to do so. Starting out, we've got a primetime matchup between Alabama and Georgia. However, sadly for the Dogs, Alabama continued their domination in the tournament, pulling away in the end and taking this one 28-10. So that leaves us with just 1 spot left, and I feel like if your team isn't in the tourney still, you've got to be rooting for one of these teams because this matchup contains the 6 seed Louisiana and 7 seed Kansas. This was another one of those pretty close games, but in the end, the Louisiana Raging Cajuns would take the last spot in our final 8, ending the Jayhawks run in our inaugural tournament. And breaking down our Elite 8, we have 1 team from each the ACC, Conference USA, and Sun Belt, and then we have 2 Big Ten teams compared to 3 SEC teams. I'm not gonna be the one to say it because once again, I am supposed to be unbiased as the host of the tournament, but that looks a lot to me like the SEC runs college football. But now it's time to see which teams will make up our final 4, so let's start out by crowning our representative from the Peach region. Both of these teams have fought long and hard to be up to this point, but right away, Caden Salter showed that he'd be a perfect fit at Colorado, throwing a pick in his own red zone, and this allowed Miami to strike first with a pass to tight end Elijah Arroyo. Luckily for Liberty though, this wouldn't hold them back too much as Caden Salter would hand the ball off to Quentin Cooley from the 1-yard line, and Cooley easily brought the score level. We'd then see both teams trade drives back and forth, and we'd stay level until Cam Ward was able to find a wide open Ray Ray in the end zone. And this was all it would take to take down Liberty, and just like that, that, our first spot in the Final Four was now filled. I feel like Jamie Chadwell and the team really proved that they could compete at the highest level, but today just wasn't their day, and with that, we're moving down to the Rose region to decide a winner between Texas A&M and Oregon. Honestly, if I had to guess what's gonna happen, I think Oregon's just got overall more talent on the team, so that's who I'd have to go with, but let's go ahead and jump into the college football sim to see who the game thinks will take it all. Right away, the Ducks came out firing in this one, holding Texas A&M scoreless in the first half while putting up 23 points of their own. And although most of these points were from field goals, by the end of the game, Jordan James would score twice and the Ducks would take down the Aggies 44-17. So that locks up our first Final Four matchup, and I just can't wait to see which powerhouse is gonna prevail and move into that prime championship spot. But before we see that, we've got to see two IRL powerhouses go at it, as in the Goodyear region, we're left with the Ohio State Buckeyes taking on the Texas Longhorns. And going into this game, I really thought Ohio State was gonna prove why they won it all in real life, as they kicked off their scoring with a scrambling touchdown from Will Howard. But after Jordan James' performance in our last game, Jaden Blue wanted to prove he wanted his name on the map as well, as he'd start out answering back with a rushing touchdown of his own. This immediately turned the tides towards the Longhorns, as Will Howard was seeing ghosts on this pick six to Malik Muhammad, and to make matters even worse, after the two schools traded field goals, Will Howard would do the same exact thing, except this time to Warren Robertson. This would eventually lead to the fall of the reigning national champs. However, one storyline we have to keep an eye on in the future is Jordan James versus Jaden Blue. Both halfbacks have scored twice in big moments for their team. However, after Jaden Blue's last touchdown, he decided to send a message to James by striking the Heisman pose in the end zone. It'll be interesting if both these teams meet up later in the tourney, but we've got to wrap up our Final Four by simming our matchup between Bama and Louisiana, and this one didn't go as many would expect. The Raging Cajuns were actually able to open up the scoring, as Ben Woldridge was able to scramble out of the pocket and pick up the 5 needed yards to the end zone. However, Alabama responded with a perfectly put together drive capped by a simple rush by Jam Miller. This would then be followed by a field goal for the Crimson Tide, and things were really looking in their favor, as they'd also get the ball coming out of half. Except things didn't go quite as planned, as Jalen Milroe would throw a 47-yard pick six to the Raging Cajun defense, and that meant that the Sunbelt representatives once again held on to a lead. It was clear who the better team was, as Bama once again put together a perfect drive, but just as things were looking promising again, Jalen threw himself another pick. All this meant was that if Louisiana could hold onto the ball long enough, then they'd be going into the Final Four as our Cinderella team, but after getting stopped on a big third down and missing a field goal wide right, Bama did what Bama does best. They drove down the field and scored with 22 seconds left on the clock, cementing their names in the Final Four and ending the Sun Belt's ride in our tournament. And even though it could have been a great story for the Raging Cajuns, they'll just have to look forward to next year to try to do even better. But with that, we only have 3 more games until we crown a champion, and let me tell you, these games are just gonna get crazier and crazier. Kicking off our Final Four, we have our number 1 seed from our Peach region taking on the number seed from our Rose region, and I think it's clear that both these teams deserve a spot in the championship. Miami had to fend off upset after upset in nearly every single one of their games, but as for Oregon, they've steamrolled against every single opponent they've been up against. Moving into our sim, Oregon picked up right where they left off, possessing the football the entire first quarter, just to end up kicking a field goal towards the end of it. But even though their offense couldn't get the best start they wanted, the same couldn't be said about their defense, who forced Miami to punt the ball back over to the Ducks, and this allowed Jordan James to add another tally to his tournament scoring. It was clear that the Miami offense just didn't come ready to play, as they wouldn't be able to produce a single score in the first half. And when they did finally get to score, it wouldn't really matter because the Ducks were already celebrating their win, taking this one 26-7. And I mean, who can really hate against them at this point? The Ducks are proving to be one of the most talented teams in our competition, but now it's time to see who they'll be seeing in the national championship. Will it be the number 1 seed out of our Pop-Tart region, or will it be the number 2 seed from the Goodyear region? This game would be opened up just like our last, as Texas started out scoring with a field goal, and as soon as they forced Bama to punt, Jaden Blue would see James's performance and raise him a performance of his own. He'd scored this touchdown here, but unlike the Miami game, Alabama wasn't ready to roll over and die. This lit a flame underneath the team, and who else than Ryan Williams to step up? The freshman put up his first big moment of the tournament, and after the defense got the Longhorns to punt the football again, things were finally looking up for Bama until they broke the number 1 rule of college football. You just can't rough the punter. You were already getting the ball back, but none of this matters now because before Bama knew it, they were down 2 possessions after 2 back-to-back field goals. And at this point, I think Bama knew their fate as Isaiah Bond gave his former team the knockout punch, but that meant that Texas would be facing Oregon for all the marbles. We finally got our matchup between Jordan James and Jaden Blue, and let's just say that this game would turn out to be the best one yet. Both of these teams fought their hearts out to get to this point, but by the end of this game, only one would be named a national champion. Kicking things off, Texas's defense put on a masterclass, getting back to Dillon Gabriel multiple times on the starting drive, but every time Oregon looked like they might have to punt, they somehow converted until they got into field goal range where they'd eventually have to settle for a field goal. This was a very different story from Texas's first drive as they do basically the complete opposite and go 3 and out due to Oregon's dominant D. This led to our first touchdown of the game coming from the hands of Terrence Ferguson, but Texas's Amari Nablack would answer right back with a tight end touchdown of his own. And even though the score didn't look too crazy at halftime, sitting at 10-7, let's just say that this opened the floodgates for the second. Coming out of halftime, Dillon Gabriel would connect with Evan Stewart for the 82-yard touchdown, and just a few moments later, Jordan James would tack on his own score, hitting the Heisman pose specifically for Jaden Blue. And at this point, you might expect Oregon to pull away like they have with every other game, but Texas wasn't ready to give up just yet. Isaiah Bond once again made his name known with an 84-yard touchdown here, and after the Texas D got the ball back, the Longhorns would drive all the way down to the end zone where Oregon's Kobe Savage would come up with the pick of the tournament. And you might think that this is where the game gets out of hand, but once again, you'd just be wrong. Even though on the very next play, Evan Stewart would link up with Gabriel for another 80-plus yard touchdown, Texas's DeAndre Moore Jr. would find himself wide open for the 29-yard score, and this brought Oregon's lead down to 10. And at this point, all I ask is that y'all stay with me here because for some reason this game still wasn't over despite Oregon recovering the onside kick, because once Texas got the ball back, they drive all the way down the field to score a 19-yard touchdown with just 17 seconds left, bringing all the drama down to the onside kick. And I feel like you just couldn't have written it any better, but just like the last one, the Ducks recovered, allowing them to take their knee and also take home the first ever college football March Madness trophy. I hope y'all enjoyed this video, and if you did, you're gonna love this video right here.